By the time Anthony Casso realized the room had turned quiet around him, the damage was already locked in, and moving backward was no longer possible. He was sitting boxed in by concrete walls, federal eyes, and paperwork thick enough to bury names that once cleared streets. People who used to lower voices around him were now speaking freely, sharing details they once protected with silence. The body count tied to his decisions still hung heavy, yet the protection he trusted had evaporated without warning. That moment did not come from a sudden mistake, but from years of stacking consequences that finally landed together. Anthony Salvatore Casso was born on May 21, 1942, in South Brooklyn, where reputation mattered early and softness attracted pressure fast. He grew up in Carroll Gardens, an area packed with the working docks, corner crews, and men who measured respect through fear. His father, Michael Casso, worked the waterfront and carried a quiet underworld reputation that followed the family name. Stories floated around the neighborhood about disputes settled with fists, pipes, and threats, creating a home environment where intimidation felt practical rather than extreme. Anthony absorbed that atmosphere before adolescence finished shaping him. The nickname gas pipe came directly from his father, who was known for carrying a metal pipe during confrontations around the docks. That image stuck with Anthony, not as a joke, but as a symbol of how problems were solved efficiently. Violence never appeared dramatic in his household. It showed up as a tool used without discussion or remorse. By his teenage years, Anthony was already moving with local street crews, including the South Brooklyn Boys, chasing quick money and attention. Petty theft, vandalism, and confrontations started building his confidence through repetition. Those early crimes were not about survival, but about proving he could press people without blinking or backing down. Arrests began stacking during the early 1960s, including charges for assault and illegal firearms possession. Each time he landed in custody, witnesses suddenly forgot details or declined to testify altogether. Law enforcement noticed the pattern, suspecting intimidation, though nothing stuck long enough for convictions. That cycle taught Anthony something important early, which was that fear could erase consequences faster than money ever could. During those years, people who crossed him learned lessons quickly, sometimes through broken bones or targeted humiliation. A childhood friend later recalled Anthony shooting pigeons from rooftops using a silenced rifle, practicing patience and control rather than chaos. That detail mattered since it showed comfort with weapons long before organized crime shaped his direction. Violence was no longer reactive for him. It became measured, deliberate, and tied to dominance. Those habits carried forward naturally as opportunities expanded. By his early 20s, Anthony caught the attention of Christopher Fornari, a Lucchese family captain running operations from Brooklyn's 19th hole clubhouse. Fornari saw usefulness in Anthony's aggression, especially paired with the discipline and follow-through. He paired Casso with Vittorio Vecamuso, another ambitious Brooklyn native eager to climb. Together, they handled enforcement, collections, and pressure jobs tied to waterfront unions and local rackets. Their reliability separated them from louder associates who talked more than they delivered. Working under Fornari placed Casso closer to organized crime mechanics without changing his mindset. He did not adjust his behavior to fit tradition. He simply applied street lessons to larger operations. When debtors stalled or resisted, pressure escalated quickly, sometimes publicly, sometimes behind closed doors. One incident involved a dock worker bragging about steel-toed boots, which ended with a heavy crate crushing his feet during a forklift accident. That moment circulated quietly, reinforcing Anthony's image as someone who enjoyed making points permanent. Confidence followed him everywhere after that, strengthened by protection and income flowing steadily upward. He learned how hierarchy worked, yet never showed patience for limits or delays. Older members noticed his willingness to act without hesitation, which made him valuable and dangerous simultaneously. During the 1970s, he moved deeper into loan sharking, extortion, and enforcement, while absorbing how decisions traveled upward. That exposure did not soften him. It sharpened his instincts further. By 1979, Anthony Casso was officially inducted as a made member of the Lucchese family alongside Vecamuso. The ceremony marked status, but it also confirmed something he already believed about himself. He saw loyalty as temporary and authority as something maintained through constant pressure. That belief formed early on Brooklyn streets, long before bosses or titles mattered. Everything that followed traced back to those lessons learned young, where fear moved faster than respect and restraint never entered the equation. By the late 1960s, Anthony Casso was no longer drifting between crews, since his proximity to Christopher Fornari placed him near real decision-makers. Fornari ran the 19th hole crew out of Brooklyn, controlling labor influence, loan sharking routes, and waterfront pressure points that demanded reliability. Casso fit that need perfectly, since he handled confrontations personally, collected debts without hesitation, and stayed quiet afterward. He did not talk flashy, rarely celebrated wins, and understood that silence protected everyone involved. That posture earned trust faster than charm ever could. Vic Amuso entered that circle at the same time, and their partnership formed through repetition rather than ceremony. They worked collections together, backed each allowing pressure to escalate naturally, and showed up whenever Furnari needed problems removed quickly. Timing mattered, since older associates were already stretched thin or distracted by side hustles. Being physically present when decisions turned urgent placed Casso and Amuso closer to the center. Over time, their names became associated with tasks nobody else volunteered to handle. Enforcement assignments expanded as the track record grew steadier across Brooklyn operations. They handled union intimidation along the docks, reminding stewards which contracts stayed untouched and which voices stayed quiet. Truckers who stalled payments learned the consequences arrived without warnings or discussions. These actions were not random, since they followed instructions precisely and reported outcomes cleanly. Furnari valued that clarity, preferring results over personalities within his crew. Casso learned quickly how hierarchy functioned, though he never showed interest in traditional respect rituals. He observed who spoke during meetings, who stayed silent, and how information flowed upward through intermediaries. He positioned himself near moments when decisions required immediate follow-through. That placement allowed him to absorb power without formal promotions. Reliability during tense moments mattered more than seniority in that environment. During the early 1970s, law enforcement pressure intensified across New York's organized crime networks. Investigations targeted visible earners, forcing captains to rely on quieter operators who attracted less attention. Casso benefited from this shift since he avoided unnecessary exposure and moved carefully between locations. His arrests rarely turned into convictions, reinforcing his image as someone difficult to pin down. That reputation made him useful when discretion became essential. Loan sharking expanded under Furnari's direction, placing Casso directly between borrowers and consequences. He structured collections to feel inevitable rather than explosive, applying steady pressure instead of public displays. When borrowers tested limits, responses escalated predictably until compliance returned. That method reduced noise while maintaining control across territories. It also taught Casso how discipline multiplied influence more effectively than chaos. By the late 1970s, Casso's value became undeniable within the Lucchese orbit. He had proven dependable across enforcement, collections, and sensitive operations requiring trust. His partnership with Amuso strengthened through shared exposure and aligned instincts. When induction opportunities arose, their names stayed near the top. In 1979, both men were formally inducted as made members, confirming positions they already occupied through action rather than ceremony. That transition did not change Casso's behavior, since he continued operating as a function-driven enforcer. He remained present during critical moments, absorbing authority through proximity and follow-through. Older figures recognized his usefulness, even if they disliked his methods. Influence expanded quietly, step by step, through timing and access rather than applause. That foundation set conditions for his next evolution inside the organization. As his standing solidified, Anthony Casso gravitated toward operations where planning mattered as much as intimidation. He became involved with the Bypass Gang, a specialized burglary ring targeting banks, jewelry stores, and secured warehouses. These jobs required patience, technical skill, and inside intelligence rather than brute force. Casso adapted easily, applying discipline learned from street enforcement to structured theft operations. Success in this lane widened his influence while limiting public exposure. The Bypass Gang operated across Manhattan and Long Island during the late 1970s and early 1980s. Members bypassed alarm systems, cracked safes, and exploited security routines with surgical precision. Casso participated directly, coordinating logistics and ensuring proceeds moved efficiently upward. Estimates later suggested the crew pulled tens of millions through repeated hits. Those earnings reinforced his belief that control mattered more than spectacle. Burglary appealed to Casso differently than street violence, since it rewarded foresight and containment. Planning reduced risk, while execution demanded calm under pressure. He valued operations where outcomes depended on preparation rather than emotional reactions. That mindset strengthened his confidence, since each successful job validated his approach. Money flowing steadily insulated him from everyday scrutiny and expanded his leverage internally. Profits from theft bolstered relationships with higher-ranking figures who benefit quietly. Kick-ups arrived on time, figures balanced correctly, and questions stayed minimal. That reliability increased his autonomy within the family. He could propose operations, fund enforcement, and support allies without requesting permission repeatedly. Financial independence fed a growing sense of invulnerability that shaped later decisions. The contrast between burglary and violence taught Casso something important about power dynamics. Fear worked fast, but money sustained influence longer across organizations. He learned to blend both approaches depending on context. Enforcement remained necessary, yet theft provided insulation and flexibility. That combination positioned him uniquely among peers who specialized narrowly. During the early 1980s, law enforcement attention intensified around theft rings connected to organized crime. Casso adjusted by tightening communication and limiting exposure points. He favored small teams, trusted intermediaries, and compartmentalized information. These adjustments reduced risk while preserving profit streams. Each adaptation reinforced his confidence in controlling complex operations. Financial success also altered how others treated him internally. Associates sought protection, introductions, and backing for side ventures. Casso evaluated these requests through loyalty and utility rather than sentiment. Support came with expectations that compliance remained absolute. That approach extended his influence beyond formal titles into everyday decision-making. Money amplified his authority during disputes, allowing him to resolve conflicts through leverage instead of overt threats. He could freeze access, redirect earnings, or fund retaliation when necessary. These options expanded his toolbox significantly. Control became layered, combining economic pressure with physical enforcement. That layered authority shaped his leadership style moving forward. By the mid-80s, Casso's operations reflected a balance between secrecy and dominance. Theft profits insulated him from dependency, while enforcement preserved boundaries. Planning replaced impulse as his primary strength. These traits positioned him for greater responsibility as leadership structures shifted. What began as survival instincts had evolved into calculated control across multiple fronts. By the early 1980s, Anthony Casso stopped treating violence as a response mechanism since it had already become his preferred method of supervision. Inside the Lucchese structure, he began framing force as preventative maintenance rather than punishment. Associates noticed that disputes no longer required escalation or warnings, since decisions jumped straight to permanent solutions. This shift unsettled older members who grew up respecting boundaries that once slowed retaliation. Casso viewed those boundaries as weaknesses that invited resistance. As his authority expanded, authorization for killings moved from rare necessity to routine approval. Targets widened beyond rivals to include internal figures whose loyalty appeared uncertain or inconvenient. Conversations that once ended with warnings now concluded with final instructions delivered quietly. Casso believed eliminating uncertainty protected operations better than negotiations ever could. That belief hardened with each incident resolved through removal rather than compromise. The Lucchese family traditionally operated through layered discipline, using fines, demotions, and isolation before violence. Casso bypassed those steps frequently, since he viewed hesitation as exposure. Captains felt pressure knowing their discretion was shrinking under his oversight. Fear replaced respect as the dominant motivator within crews reporting upward. That environment discouraged dialogue, leaving silence as the safest posture. His partnership with Vicamuso reinforced this approach, since both men shared impatience for dissent. Together they evaluated problems through outcomes rather than precedent. When disagreements surfaced among crews, resolution favored decisive elimination. That alignment accelerated cultural change inside the family. Members adapted quickly, understanding that hesitation carried consequences. Violence also became a communication tool directed inward, shaping behavior without explicit orders. Stories circulated about sudden disappearances tied to minor infractions. These narratives traveled faster than formal directives, altering how associates behaved daily. Casso understood that reputation governed compliance more effectively than meetings. Maintaining that reputation required consistent follow-through. By the mid-80s, paranoia increased across New York, organized crime networks due to federal prosecutions. Many leaders responded cautiously, limiting exposure and avoiding internal conflict. Casso moved opposite, tightening control through intensified enforcement. He interpreted pressure as justification for purging perceived weaknesses. That interpretation isolated him further from traditionalists. One early sign of rule erosion involved discussions about targeting family members of suspected informants. Older figures recoiled at those conversations, recalling long-standing prohibitions. Casso dismissed objections, framing relatives as leverage points rather than civilians. Even when action stopped short, the willingness itself changed internal dynamics. Trust eroded quickly once lines blurred publicly. The psychological impact rippled outward through the crews accustomed to predictable discipline. Associates began second-guessing interactions, measuring words carefully, and avoiding informal gatherings. Social bonds weakened as self-preservation dominated behavior. That atmosphere reduced collaboration, though compliance increased superficially. Casso accepted that trade-off, valuing obedience over cohesion. Fear also distorted information flow. Since subordinates avoided delivering bad news upward, problems stayed hidden until consequences surfaced violently. Casso misinterpreted that silence as efficiency, reinforcing his methods. This feedback loop deepened mistrust throughout the hierarchy. Early cracks formed beneath apparent order. Enforcement assignments expanded beyond traditional rivals to include peripheral figures connected indirectly to disputes. This expansion signaled a move from control toward eradication. Associates struggled to anticipate boundaries, since the criteria shifted unpredictably. Casso preferred unpredictability, believing it prevented organized resistance. That belief drove increasingly aggressive decision-making. Financial independence from burglary profits amplified this posture, removing reliance on consensus. He could fund actions autonomously, bypassing deliberation. Money shielded him from accountability while enabling unilateral enforcement. That autonomy emboldened choices previously considered excessive. Structural safeguards weakened accordingly. During this period, Lucchese crews in New Jersey experienced heightened pressure over revenue sharing. Resistance met threats rather than negotiation, escalating tensions quickly. At one point, discussions surfaced about eliminating entire factions rather than resolving disputes. Though not fully executed, the intent sent shockwaves internally. That moment illustrated how extermination entered his vocabulary. Casso justified these positions as necessary discipline during unstable times. He argued survival required removing anyone who slowed the response or questioned authority. Associates listened without challenging publicly, though resentment grew privately. That silent resentment would later surface unexpectedly. Seeds planted during this phase would mature under pressure. Leadership meetings shifted tone, becoming transactional rather than collaborative. Casso spoke less, expecting understanding without explanation. Orders carried finality, leaving little room for interpretation. That style compressed decision cycles while increasing fear. Operational speed increased alongside internal anxiety. The shift toward extermination altered recruitment and promotion patterns within the family. Loyalty became measured through compliance rather than competence. Capable earners who questioned directives found themselves sidelined or worse. Mediocre operators advanced through unquestioning obedience. This imbalance weakened institutional resilience. Casso appeared unconcerned with the long-term consequences, focusing on immediate control. He believed authority required constant reinforcement through decisive action. That worldview ignored sustainability, though results initially appeared effective. Rivals hesitated, internal dissent quieted, and operations continued. Surface stability masked deeper fractures forming quietly. By embracing violence as governance, Casso narrowed the options available during crises. Dialogue pathways closed, leaving only force as a resolution. That rigidity reduced adaptability under evolving threats. Associates recognized this limitation, storing doubts privately. Those doubts would matter later. Throughout this phase, Casso's confidence hardened into certainty, dismissing alternative approaches. He trusted fear to carry weight indefinitely. History suggested otherwise, though he ignored precedent. The culture he shaped rewarded silence and punished hesitation. That culture carried forward into later conflicts. Violence had become institutionalized language rather than emergency response. Decisions followed patterns that eliminated nuance. People adapted their behavior accordingly, prioritizing invisibility. The organization moved forward, yet cohesion deteriorated gradually. This stage marked a turning point from management toward domination. Those around Casso felt the change immediately, even if they lacked the language to describe it. Loyalty felt conditional, safety temporary, and trust non-existent. The Lucchese family continued operating, though under strain. What appeared efficient masked underlying instability. That instability waited patiently for opportunity. By the end of this period, Casso stood firmly committed to governance through fear. He believed authority demanded constant assertion. The organization reflected his temperament increasingly. Future events would test that structure severely. The groundwork for betrayal had been laid quietly. By the mid-80s, the New York mob world was already tense. But December 16, 1985, changed the temperature permanently across every family. Paul Castellano, the Gambino boss, was shot dead outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan, alongside his driver Thomas Bellotti. The hit happened in public, without commission approval, and everyone understood that the rule had been violated openly. John Gotti did not just remove a boss, he rewrote the limits, forcing others to respond. Anthony Casso paid attention immediately, since broken rules never stayed isolated for long. Inside the Lucchese camp, Anthony "Tony Ducks" Corallo and Genovese boss Vincent Gigante saw the killing as reckless and destabilizing. They viewed Gotti's move as a challenge to structure rather than ambition alone. Casso shared that assessment, believing unchecked power invited chaos that threatened everyone. He reportedly warned Gambino underboss Frank DeSico before the hit, explaining that killing a boss without approval would trigger consequences. That warning was ignored, and Castellano still ended up bleeding on the sidewalk. Once Castellano was dead, retaliation discussions moved quickly behind closed doors. Corallo turned to Casso, trusting his willingness to act where others hesitated. Plans were formed to remove Gotti before his position solidified further. The assignment reflected confidence in Casso's judgment and aggression. This was no routine enforcement job, since the target sat atop one of the 5 families. Casso coordinated with a Genovese-connected bomb maker, choosing a method rarely used in New York mob conflicts. Car bombs carried symbolism, signaling escalation beyond street shootings. The plan centered on Frank DeSico's Buick, assuming Gotti would be present during a meeting at the Veterans and Friends Club in Brooklyn. Surveillance suggested patterns, though certainty remained elusive. That uncertainty did not stop execution preparations. On April 13, 1986, the device was planted beneath DeSico's vehicle and rigged for remote detonation. Timing mattered, since bystanders increased the risk exponentially. Fate intervened when Gotti skipped the meeting unexpectedly. DeSico entered the car with another associate, unaware of what waited below. Moments later, the bomb detonated violently, killing DeSico instantly and severely injuring the passenger. The explosion shocked the city and the mob alike, since bombs rarely appeared in New York crime wars. Instead of eliminating Gotti, the blast removed his closest lieutenant. That outcome shifted dynamics immediately, intensifying hostility rather than resolving it. Casso later admitted he did not wear his glasses that day, contributing to misidentification. That detail circulated quietly, adding irony to tragedy. Consequences followed quickly, since the Gambinos recognized the attempt as a declaration of war. Gotti understood someone powerful had authorized that level of aggression. Casso knew retaliation would follow, increasing his sense of exposure. Paranoia sharpened as he anticipated responses from multiple directions. The failed hit placed him squarely within Gotti's sights. The DeSico bombing also unsettled traditionalists across other families. Using explosives crossed a psychological boundary that many deliberately avoided. That choice suggested desperation or confidence beyond normal limits. Casso viewed it as a necessary escalation under new conditions. Others saw it as reckless, inviting scrutiny and chaos. Law enforcement attention intensified immediately after the bombing. Investigators treated the case differently from typical shootings. Surveillance increased around known figures, while informants sensed opportunity. Casso felt pressure closing in from multiple angles simultaneously. That pressure reinforced his belief that decisive force remained the only reliable response. Within months, larger disruptions compounded instability. The commission trial concluded later in 1986, sending top bosses to prison, including Tony Ducks Corallo. Leadership vacuums opened suddenly across families. Corallo, facing life sentences, named Vic Amuso as Lucchese boss, with Casso elevated alongside him. That decision placed both men at the top during extreme turbulence. Casso interpreted his elevation as validation rather than a warning. He believed surviving escalating conflict confirmed his instincts. Authority came without buffers, since predecessors were incarcerated. That freedom removed restraints normally applied by elders. Power arrived alongside danger, intensifying his vigilance. After the bombing, Casso moved with heightened caution, altering routines and limiting exposure. He suspected Gambino retaliation at every turn. That suspicion extended beyond rivals toward associates and even allies. Trust narrowed significantly, shaping future decisions. Violence became preemptive rather than reactive. The failed attempt hardened his resolve to eliminate perceived threats thoroughly. Half measures appeared insufficient after that point. He believed incomplete actions invited survival and revenge. That logic fueled subsequent decisions with broader consequences. Lines once debated were now dismissed outright. Internally, some Lucchese figures questioned the wisdom of provoking open war with the Gambinos. Casso viewed hesitation as a vulnerability that needed correction. Dissent retreated underground rather than disappearing. Fear muted discussion, leaving unresolved concerns to fester. That silence would later matter significantly. The bombing also altered Casso's view of operational risk. Precision failures haunted him, emphasizing uncontrollable variables. That awareness increased reliance on intelligence rather than observation alone. He began seeking deeper access to information channels. This search led him toward unconventional solutions. Law enforcement infiltration became a central concern, prompting Casso to secure protection through corruption. He recognized information asymmetry as survival currency. Knowing investigations early meant staying ahead. That pursuit shaped his next major move. The Desico bombing indirectly accelerated that trajectory. From this point forward, Casso believed he lived under constant threat. Sleep patterns changed, movement routes varied, and meetings became rare. He trusted fewer people daily. That isolation reinforced aggressive instincts. Safety felt temporary, requiring constant enforcement. The Gotti problem was never resolved cleanly, lingering as background pressure. The Gambinos remained intact, while Casso's circle shrank gradually. Paranoia grew alongside authority. That combination proved volatile. The missed bomb marked a psychological turning point. What began as retaliation escalated into sustained instability across families. Boundaries dissolved under pressure, changing how leadership operated. Casso adapted through force and secrecy. Each adaptation carried unintended consequences. Those consequences accumulated quietly. By the end of this phase, Casso no longer believed restraint offered protection. He viewed survival as dominance, maintained relentlessly. The bomb that missed taught lessons he internalized deeply. Those lessons shaped everything that followed. The city moved forward, but nothing felt settled again. When the commission trial wrapped up in late 1986, the New York underworld looked stripped and exposed, since its top figures were suddenly headed for life sentences. Tony Duck's Corralo was gone, the old buffers were removed, and quiet discipline lost its guardians. Leadership changed hands fast, not through debate, but necessity shaped by indictments and empty chairs. Vic Amuso was named boss of the Lucchese family, with Anthony Casso elevated beside him. That promotion landed during chaos, giving Casso authority without breaks or elders watching closely. Power arrived without the usual friction that slowed decisions in earlier decades. Casso interpreted this absence as permission rather than danger. He believed the moment demanded decisive control instead of consensus. Authority amplified instincts already shaped by suspicion and force. Leadership, in his view, meant preventing problems permanently rather than managing them patiently. Once seated, Casso began issuing directives that skipped traditional steps entirely. Fines, demotions, and warnings faded from use across Lucchese operations. Suspected disloyalty moved straight to elimination conversations. Captains recognized the shift quickly, adjusting behavior to avoid attention. Silence became survival currency under this new order. The New Jersey faction experienced this transformation firsthand during disputes over revenue sharing. Resistance to increased kick-ups met immediate hostility. Discussions escalated rapidly toward eradication rather than compromise. At one point, Casso authorized conversations about wiping out entire crews rather than negotiating percentages. Though not fully executed, the intent alone rattled hardened members. Threats toward families crossed boundaries that few believed possible inside traditional structures. Wives and relatives became leverage points discussed openly. That willingness stunned older figures raised on strict codes. Casso dismissed objections, arguing fear traveled faster through bloodlines. This reasoning fractured remaining trust among leadership circles. Orders flowed directly from suspicion to execution planning, bypassing investigation phases. Casso valued speed over certainty, believing hesitation invited betrayal. Associates noticed how quickly names appeared on lists after minor disputes. That unpredictability enforced compliance effectively. It also seeded deep resentment beneath surface obedience. Leadership meetings transformed into one-directional sessions lacking dialogue. Casso spoke with finality, expecting understanding without explanation. Questions disappeared, replaced by nods and quiet exits. That environment discouraged initiative while reinforcing hierarchy. Fear replaced ambition as the primary motivator. The psychological toll spread across crews, altering daily routines and social behavior. Associates avoided gatherings, limited conversations, and compartmentalized information aggressively. Trust networks collapsed into isolated units focused on self-preservation. Casso accepted this fragmentation as necessary collateral. Control mattered more than cohesion within his framework. Financial autonomy fueled this posture. since burglary profits insulated him from reliance on collective approval. He funded enforcement independently, bypassing captains when needed. That independence removed constraints that previously moderated decisions. Authority concentrated further, narrowing accountability. This concentration accelerated excesses. By the late 1980s, Lucchese operations reflected Casso's temperament clearly. Aggression guided management, secrecy replaced transparency, and fear enforced order. Rivals hesitated, while internal dissent retreated underground. The organization continued functioning, though under strain. Casso interpreted this as success rather than a warning. The absence of elders removed voices that once challenged extreme proposals quietly. Younger members lacked the confidence to object. Older traditionalists stayed silent to avoid attention. That vacuum allowed Casso's instincts to dominate unchecked. Authority no longer required persuasion. Casso's leadership style discouraged compromise during disputes with other families. Minor disagreements escalated quickly into threats. Relationships deteriorated under constant pressure. Diplomacy faded, replaced by readiness for confrontation. This posture increased isolation across the 5 families. Internal discipline hardened further as informant paranoia intensified nationwide. Federal prosecutions loomed constantly, encouraging caution elsewhere. Casso responded through intensified purges rather than defensive tightening. He believed eliminating weak links reduced exposure. That approach ignored alternative explanations for pressure. The attempted hit on Pete Chiodo illustrated this mindset clearly. Chiodo, a longtime Lucchese captain and close associate, faced suspicion following indictments. Rather than wait, Casso authorized his elimination. The attack failed, leaving Chiodo wounded but alive. That failure carried massive consequences. Chiodo's survival triggered unprecedented threats toward his family. Casso authorized warnings that extended beyond him personally. Such threats violated long-held prohibitions explicitly. This action shocked remaining traditionalists profoundly. It also pushed Chiodo toward cooperation with authorities. That outcome revealed a flaw in Casso's calculus. Fear forced compliance temporarily, but extreme pressure accelerated defections. Associates noticed the pattern quietly. Loyalty weakened as self-preservation gained priority. Seeds planted earlier began sprouting under stress. Alphonse Darco felt this shift acutely while serving as acting boss during Amuso and Casso's absences. He initially followed orders faithfully, organizing construction rackets and relaying messages. Over time, he sensed suspicion turning toward him. Casso's behavior convinced him that safety no longer existed internally. Darco observed how quickly proximity transformed into liability. Mistakes, real or imagined, carried lethal consequences. His fear intensified after Chiodo's attempted murder. Believing his family faced a similar risk, he chose survival over loyalty. That decision marked another fracture caused by Casso's governance. Leadership through terror also disrupted information quality. Associates avoided delivering bad news upward. Problems remained hidden until damage surfaced visibly. Casso misread silence as efficiency. This misinterpretation reinforced aggressive tactics further. As authority centralized, Casso's circle shrank gradually. Trusted advisors disappeared through death, defection, or distance. Remaining contacts offered filtered information shaped by fear. Decision-making degraded as feedback loops collapsed. Casso compensated through increased control attempts. Power removed friction completely, allowing suspicion to trigger an immediate response. That speed felt effective short-term. Long-term stability eroded steadily beneath surface order. The organization functioned, though brittle. Stress fractures multiplied quietly. By the early 1990s, the Lucchese family resembled a machine running without lubrication. Movement continued, but wear increased visibly. Casso pushed harder, believing force solved resistance. Each push weakened structural integrity further. The collapse approached unnoticed by those enforcing it. The transformation from management to domination reached completion during this phase. Violence governed behavior, relationships, and strategy. Authority amplified Casso's worst instincts unchecked. Decisions moved from thought to action instantly. Burning the house down felt preferable to losing control within it. This period defined Casso's legacy internally, long before law enforcement intervened decisively. Fear carried weight, though loyalty evaporated quietly. Associates adapted outwardly while planning exits inwardly. The seeds of betrayal matured under relentless pressure. The structure stood, though foundations crumbled unseen. By the late 1980s, Anthony Casso stopped worrying about police attention in the usual way, since he believed exposure could be managed rather than avoided. He understood investigations created pressure, yet pressure meant nothing if information flowed in his direction first. That realization reshaped how he thought about safety, authority, and reach across New York. Instead of hiding from law enforcement, he decided to bring parts of it inside his orbit quietly. That decision marked one of the most dangerous shifts in his entire career. Casso's connection to corrupt NYPD detectives Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa did not begin loudly or suddenly, since relationships like that rarely do. These were experienced officers with decades on the job, trusted within the department and respected publicly. Through intermediaries, Casso learned they were open to exchanging information for money. That exchange started small, built on tips about surveillance and informants. Over time, it evolved into something far more lethal. He referred to them as his crystal ball, since they could see problems before they surfaced officially. They accessed police databases, shared intelligence on wiretaps, and identified potential cooperators early. That access changed Casso's posture entirely, since surprise disappeared from his world. Instead of reacting to arrests, he anticipated them. This anticipation reinforced his belief that he operated above normal risk. Money kept the arrangement stable, flowing monthly alongside bonuses for specific tasks. Payments reportedly reached thousands per month, with additional sums tied to completed jobs. The detectives treated the relationship like a side business rather than a betrayal. Their badges provided credibility that street associates could never match. That credibility allowed operations impossible otherwise. The first known case showing the system's full shape involved James "Jimmy" Heidel, a Gambino associate suspected of involvement in a plot against Casso. Rather than send street shooters, Casso deployed the detectives directly. They approached Heidel posing as police conducting a routine arrest. Heidel complied, assuming the procedure protected him. That assumption sealed his fate. Ippolito and Caracappa handcuffed Heidel, placed him into a vehicle, and drove him away from public view. Instead of a precinct, they delivered him to a garage under Casso's control. There, Heidel was restrained and interrogated about who authorized attempts on Casso's life. Casso later admitted to shooting him repeatedly, choosing body shots to avoid blood damage inside the location. That murder established a repeatable method. The system relied on impersonated arrests, controlled environments, and clean removals. Bodies vanished without scenes or witnesses. Police reports reflected routine activity rather than crimes. That efficiency emboldened Casso, since results reinforced confidence. Each success validated the structure, encouraging reuse. Another case demonstrated the system's flaws, revealing how reliance on intelligence carried risks. In December 1986, Nicholas Guido, an innocent telephone company worker, was murdered outside his Brooklyn home. Casso believed Guido shared a name with a Gambino associate involved in plots against him. Acting on faulty intelligence, the wrong man died. This mistake underscored dangers within the system, though it did not deter further use. Despite that error, the arrangement continued expanding, since perceived benefits outweighed consequences. The detectives provided names, locations, and routines of suspected informants. Casso responded with removals, trusting information implicitly. This trust replaced verification processes entirely. Over time, this shortcut normalized irreversible decisions. The murder of Gambino Captain Edward "Eddie" Lino in November 1990 illustrated the system operating at its peak. Lino was pulled over on the Belt Parkway by Ippolito and Caracappa, who conducted a fake traffic stop. As Lino sat in his vehicle, Caracappa approached and shot him at close range. The scene appeared like a sudden roadside killing, though law enforcement involvement ensured confusion. Casso reportedly paid a substantial bonus for that hit, recognizing its symbolic value. Killing a high-ranking Gambino using police officers sent a clear message about reach. It also reinforced Casso's belief that he controlled multiple layers of the city simultaneously. The detectives functioned as extensions of his will rather than separate actors. That integration blurred boundaries completely. Over several years, Ippolito and Caracappa participated in multiple abductions and murders tied to Casso's orders. They provided protection during meetings, ran license plates, and flagged threats. Their presence reduced uncertainty during operations. Casso trusted them more than many made members. That trust carried severe consequences later. Internally, Casso relied on Burton Kaplan as a go-between, insulating direct contact while maintaining control. Kaplan managed payments and scheduling, keeping the system running smoothly. This compartmentalization limited exposure initially. It also made detection harder for investigators. The machinery functioned quietly for years. The disappearance business thrived under these conditions, since victims rarely anticipated police involvement as a danger. Impersonation disarmed targets psychologically, reducing resistance. This method avoided public violence while achieving finality. Efficiency reinforced belief in permanence. Casso began viewing disappearances as cleaner solutions than shootings. Access to law enforcement intelligence reshaped Casso's confidence profoundly. He believed he could predict investigations, neutralize witnesses, and erase threats preemptively. That belief expanded his willingness to authorize killings. Limits dissolved as perceived risk declined. Untouchable became more than a word. The system also insulated Casso from internal challenges, since associates feared surveillance exposure. Knowing that police information flowed upward discouraged dissent. Loyalty became survival, while silence remained safest. The arrangement reinforced dominance without overt displays. Control deepened quietly. However, reliance on corrupt officers created dependencies that Casso underestimated. Trust is concentrated dangerously around a few individuals. If compromised, the fallout would be catastrophic. That risk remained invisible while operations succeeded. Confidence masked vulnerability effectively. Law enforcement corruption of this magnitude shocked later investigators, since it contradicted assumptions about institutional integrity. At the time, Casso viewed it pragmatically. He believed systems existed to be exploited. Morality never entered calculations. Utility guided decisions exclusively. The disappearance machinery required constant feeding, as paranoia generated targets steadily. Each suspected informant became a problem needing resolution. The detectives supplied names, sometimes based on rumors or partial data. Verification remained minimal. Speed mattered more than certainty. As usage increased, Casso's worldview hardened further. He believed no space existed beyond his reach. Streets, courts, and precincts felt accessible. This perception influenced every subsequent decision. Fear of consequences diminished steadily. Yet cracks formed quietly beneath confidence. The mistaken killing of Nicholas Guido lingered as evidence of fallibility. Rumors circulated among associates about police involvement. Whispers attracted attention from investigators gradually. The system left traces despite care. By the early 1990s, federal agencies began revisiting cold cases tied to unexplained disappearances. Patterns emerged linking victims to police encounters. Internal affairs investigations stirred quietly. Casso sensed pressure. Though he trusted his crystal ball to warn him, that trust delayed caution. The detectives themselves grew bolder, operating beyond information sharing into direct violence repeatedly. Each act increased exposure risk. Casso compensated through increased payments and secrecy. Confidence remained high, though margins shrank. The machinery strained under the weight. Ultimately, the system fed Casso's belief in inevitability, convincing him that survival required continued aggression. He interpreted success as proof of correctness. This interpretation blinded him to accumulating threats. Untouchable felt permanent, though reality disagreed. The Mafia Cop's arrangement defined this era completely, reshaping how Casso viewed power. Law enforcement intelligence became weaponized rather than feared. Disappearances replaced disputes as preferred solutions. This structure carried him forward temporarily. It also built the evidence that would later dismantle everything. By the early 1990s, Anthony Casso's attention shifted away from rival families toward dangers he believed lived inside his own structure. Federal indictments kept landing. Whispers traveled faster than confirmations, and silence from trusted figures felt louder than confessions. He interpreted hesitation as evidence, viewing caution as camouflage for betrayal. That mindset narrowed his circle daily, shrinking tolerance for ambiguity. Control no longer meant managing operations smoothly. It meant identifying threats before they surfaced. Pete Chiodo stood near the center of this collapse, since his history placed him close enough to feel trusted, yet visible enough to draw suspicion. Chiodo ran the New Jersey faction, handled serious money, and understood family dynamics deeply. After indictments connected to the Windows case surfaced, Casso convinced himself that Chiodo might cooperate. No confirmation existed, yet paranoia filled the gaps quickly. Decisions followed fear rather than proof, setting irreversible events into motion. On May 8, 1991, gunmen ambushed Chiodo outside a Staten Island gas station, firing repeatedly at close range. Chiodo survived miraculously, since his size absorbed damage that should have killed him. That survival infuriated Casso, who interpreted failure as increased danger rather than a warning. Instead of pulling back, he escalated pressure dramatically. He authorized messages threatening Chiodo's wife, signaling a willingness to violate long-held prohibitions openly. That threat altered everything internally, since families had remained off-limits historically. Older Lucchese figures understood the severity immediately, recognizing boundaries had dissolved completely. Fear transformed into panic among captains who once believed rank offered insulation. Loyalty cracked under the weight of unpredictable consequences. Chiodo, facing threats toward his family, chose cooperation with authorities as a survival strategy. Chiodo's decision sent shockwaves through the organization, confirming fears others had suppressed quietly. If a longtime captain could be targeted so aggressively, nobody felt protected. Associates reassessed risk calculations overnight. Silence became an insufficient defense against suspicion. Casso's approach accelerated defections rather than preventing them. The psychological impact extended beyond Chiodo's immediate circle, reshaping daily interactions across crews. Conversations shortened, meetings thinned, and trust evaporated steadily. People avoided visibility, limiting exposure even to allies. Casso mistook this withdrawal for discipline. In reality, it reflected fear-driven disengagement. Alphonse Little Al Darko experienced this shift firsthand while serving as acting boss during Amuso and Casso's absences. Initially loyal, Darko executed directives faithfully, organizing rackets and relaying communications. Over time, he sensed suspicion creeping toward him without explanation. Observing Chiodo's treatment convinced him that safety no longer existed internally. Darko recognized patterns forming, where proximity translated into liability rather than trust. Each interaction felt like an evaluation, and every delay was interpreted negatively. He began believing his family faced imminent danger regardless of performance. That belief pushed him toward an unthinkable choice previously unimaginable. Survival outweighed loyalty when fear dominated calculations. In September 1991, Darko contacted the FBI, entering witness protection alongside his family. His cooperation marked a historic moment, since he became the first New York Mafia boss to flip. That decision reflected Casso's leadership consequences directly. Terror-driven governance fractured loyalty irreversibly. Control weakened the structure it depended upon. As defections multiplied, Casso tightened oversight further, believing betrayal stemmed from insufficient pressure. He authorized additional purges, expanding target lists beyond confirmed cooperators. Associates disappeared based on rumor rather than evidence. Each disappearance amplified fear while degrading intelligence quality. Information flow deteriorated as self-preservation dominated behavior. Captains stopped sharing concerns upward, fearing misinterpretation. Problems festered unseen until consequences exploded unexpectedly. Casso interpreted surprises as justification for harsher measures. This feedback loop deepened mistrust throughout the hierarchy. Decision-making suffered as accurate reporting vanished. The internal environment resembled containment rather than collaboration. Since fear shaped every interaction, meetings became formalities, devoid of substance or debate. Orders traveled downward without context, leaving confusion behind. Associates followed instructions mechanically, avoiding initiative. That compliance masked operational fragility. Financial operations suffered quietly during this phase, though numbers appeared stable superficially. Kick-ups continued, yet efficiency declined as capable earners withdrew or defected. Mediocre performers advanced through obedience rather than competence. Long-term sustainability eroded beneath apparent order. Casso overlooked these signs. Paranoia extended beyond associates to entire crews viewed as potential liabilities. The New Jersey faction faced continuous scrutiny, despite reduced capacity following Chiodo's departure. Casso considered wiping remaining elements rather than stabilizing operations. That consideration alarmed even hardened loyalists. Discussions reflected extermination rather than management. These internal tensions weakened external relationships as well, since alliances relied on predictable leadership. Other families observed the Lucchese instability cautiously, limiting cooperation. Casso viewed isolation as confirmation of conspiracies rather than a consequence of behavior. This misinterpretation reinforced aggressive responses. Self-imposed isolation intensified. Fear reshaped recruitment patterns, discouraging ambitious newcomers. Younger associates hesitated to step forward, recognizing that visibility carried danger. The pipeline thinned gradually, weakening future capacity. Casso prioritized immediate compliance over succession planning. That short-sightedness compounded instability. As law enforcement pressure mounted, informants supplied details from within fractured ranks. Casso sensed leaks everywhere, though sources remained unclear. Instead of improving security systems, he pursued eliminations. This approach reduced information further, increasing reliance on flawed intelligence. The cycle intensified relentlessly. Casso's personal circle contracted severely, leaving few trusted advisors. Remaining contacts filtered information to protect themselves. Decision-making occurred within an echo chamber shaped by fear. Reality distorted accordingly. Strategic blindness grew quietly. Despite these fractures, Casso maintained confidence publicly, projecting authority through reputation alone. That projection relied on past actions rather than present cohesion. Associates complied outwardly while planning exits privately. The organization functioned, though hollowed internally. Collapse approached gradually. The attempted murder of Chiodo marked a turning point. No corrective action followed. Instead of recalibrating, Casso doubled down on terror. That choice accelerated internal decay. Each defection validated paranoia while weakening the structure further. Control consumed itself slowly. By late 1991, Lucchese leadership resembled a shell maintained through fear alone. Loyalty evaporated, replaced by survival instincts. Information became unreliable, decisions reactionary. Casso sensed danger everywhere, though remedies worsened conditions. Isolation intensified as authority hardened. This inward turn revealed a core contradiction within Casso's approach. Fear enforced obedience temporarily, yet destroyed trust permanently. Governance through terror undermined the stability needed for longevity. Associates recognized this imbalance intuitively. Many chose cooperation as a rational escape. Paranoia had fully turned inward, devouring the structure piece by piece. What once functioned through hierarchy collapsed into suspicion. Casso stood increasingly alone, surrounded by silence rather than loyalty. Control weakened as fear spread unchecked. The organization fractured under pressure it could no longer absorb. By the end of this phase, betrayal no longer felt surprising, only inevitable. Seeds planted earlier matured under relentless stress. Casso's methods produced the very outcomes he feared most. The Lucchese family survived formally, though fundamentally altered. Internal collapse set the stage for the final unraveling. By May 1990, Anthony Casso understood the ground beneath him had shifted, since indictments signaled that staying visible meant eventual capture. Federal prosecutors prepared sweeping racketeering charges tied to the Windows case, naming leadership figures directly. Before warrants reached the street, Casso disappeared, choosing movement over surrender. He left Brooklyn quietly, abandoning routines that once defined his control. Life on the run demanded adaptation, though retreat never crossed his mind. Casso moved between safe houses across New York and neighboring states, relying on loyalists whose numbers dwindled steadily. Each location offered temporary security paired with fresh uncertainty. Trust narrowed sharply, forcing him to evaluate hosts constantly. Communication required discipline, since phones created exposure. He favored payphones, intermediaries, and coded instructions delivered sparingly. Despite hiding, Casso continued issuing orders, believing authority required visibility through action rather than presence. Violence did not pause during his absence, since instructions traveled outward steadily. He authorized hits, resolved disputes, and managed finances remotely. Associates understood expectations remained unchanged. Absence altered logistics, not temperament. Vic Amuso's arrest in July 1991 intensified pressure dramatically, leaving Casso isolated further. Amuso was captured in Scranton, Pennsylvania, ending their joint flight. Rumors circulated about betrayal sources, including speculation involving Casso himself. That suspicion deepened paranoia, shrinking trust further. Leadership fell entirely on Casso's shoulders while hiding. Casso attempted to maintain structure through acting bosses and intermediaries. Alphonse Darco initially filled that role, relaying messages between fugitives and crews. Over time, mistrust strained that arrangement. Casso suspected information leaks everywhere, despite limited evidence. That suspicion compromised communication quality steadily. Managing operations remotely amplified delays and misunderstandings. Orders traveled through layers, increasing distortion risk. Casso responded by simplifying directives, favoring decisive actions. He believed clarity reduced betrayal opportunities. This approach increased violence frequency, reinforcing fear-driven compliance. Financial flows continued, though inefficiencies grew unnoticed. Kick-ups arrived irregularly as networks fractured. Casso interpreted disruptions as disloyalty rather than structural strain. Responses followed predictable patterns involving pressure escalation. This cycle strained remaining alliances. Safe houses rotated frequently as Casso feared surveillance constantly. Movement disrupted stability, complicating command continuity. Each relocation required recalibration of contacts and procedures. That instability wore on supporters gradually. Fatigue set in alongside fear. During this period, Casso considered drastic measures against perceived threats. Discussions surfaced about targeting prosecutors and judges, reflecting desperation under pressure. Though never executed, the intent illustrated mental strain. Boundaries eroded further as survival instincts dominated. Authority felt threatened, demanding constant assertion. Reliance on corrupt law enforcement contacts continued initially, though access weakened. Increased scrutiny disrupted information flow from inside precincts. Casso sensed diminishing warning time before actions. This loss unsettled him deeply. Predictability vanished as systems strained. The shrinking circle around him affected decision-making significantly. Advisors filtered information to protect themselves. Reality reached Casso distorted through fear. Strategic blindness increased quietly, yet he pressed forward regardless. Casso's fugitive lifestyle demanded vigilance that never relaxed. Sleep patterns shifted, routes changed constantly, and meetings remained rare. He trusted almost nobody fully. Isolation deepened daily. That isolation reinforced reliance on force. Despite uncertainty, stepping back never appealed to him. He believed retreat signaled weakness that invited attack. Maintaining aggression felt safer than withdrawal. Violence continued as proof of relevance. Fear remained his currency. As months passed, pressure from law enforcement steadily increased. Informants supplied details from fractured ranks. Safe spaces narrowed, while exposure risk increased. Casso sensed convergence approaching. Survival required sharper moves. He contemplated leaving the region entirely, though logistical challenges complicated escape. Family ties and operational concerns anchored him nearby. Each option carried risk. Decision paralysis emerged briefly. He responded through renewed aggression. By late 1992, his options had narrowed severely. Allies defected, were arrested, or distanced themselves. Communication lines frayed dangerously. Control slipped despite continued effort. Authority felt fragile for the first time. Casso remained active, issuing orders even as capture loomed. He believed influence required constant demonstration. This belief prevented disengagement. Violence substituted for visibility. The organization continued responding, though weakening. Running did not soften him. It hardened instincts shaped by fear. Every interaction felt transactional, measured for threat. Trust disappeared completely. Survival overshadowed strategy. Short-term thinking dominated. As law enforcement closed in, Casso's fugitive chapter approached its end. He remained convinced the control could outpace pressure. That conviction delayed surrender considerations. Reality moved faster than belief. Capture waited quietly ahead. On January 19, 1993, federal agents tracked him to a house in Bud Lake, New Jersey. He was arrested unexpectedly, ending years of flight. The moment felt abrupt, though consequences accumulated long before. Life on the run had sustained control temporarily. It could not prevent collapse indefinitely. After his arrest in January 1993, Anthony Casso entered custody, carrying information heavy enough to shake institutions. Yet he also carried habits that refused adjustment. He understood the federal leverage immediately, since racketeering counts stacked toward life without daylight. Cooperation appeared practical, not remorse-driven, framed as another survival tactic. Prosecutors saw value in his access, while Casso saw an opportunity to control outcomes again. That mismatch shaped everything that followed. Casso agreed to cooperate within weeks, offering details spanning decades of murders, extortion schemes, and internal leadership decisions. He named names across the Lucchese family, outlined chains of command, and explained enforcement mechanics with precision. His disclosures included specific dates, locations, and participants tied to unsolved killings. He also described relationships with corrupt officials previously considered rumors. Initially, the scope impressed prosecutors accustomed to partial narratives. One of the most explosive elements involved Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa, confirming long-suspected corruption within the NYPD. Casso detailed payments, assignments, and murders involving the detectives. His testimony filled gaps that investigators struggled with for years. That cooperation eventually led to indictments and convictions years later. The information carried institutional weight regardless of his fate. Despite that value, problems emerged almost immediately, rooted in Casso's inability to relinquish control. He continued issuing threats from custody, attempting to intimidate witnesses and manipulate narratives. Prison calls reflected hostility rather than compliance. Prosecutors noticed patterns inconsistent with cooperation agreements. Trust eroded quickly as behavior contradicted expectations. Casso also violated cooperation rules by withholding information selectively, choosing what to disclose strategically. He attempted to shape cases to punish enemies while protecting preferred figures. That approach mirrored his street governance style. Federal agents recognized manipulation tactics familiar from organized crime cases. This recognition raised red flags early. During debriefings, Casso frequently argued with handlers, challenging interpretations and resisting constraints. He corrected prosecutors aggressively, framing himself as an authority rather than a witness. This posture frustrated negotiations. Cooperation required submission to the process, something Casso resisted instinctively. Power struggles replaced collaboration gradually. He also continued displaying aggression toward other inmates, reinforcing perceptions that his mindset remained unchanged. Guards reported incidents contradicting claims of transformation. These behaviors undermined credibility during hearings. Prosecutors began questioning whether cooperation could proceed safely. Each incident weakened his position further. As months passed, Casso violated conditions repeatedly, including attempts to pass messages externally. Investigators intercepted communications, suggesting continued influence efforts. These actions breached the trust foundational to cooperation agreements. Prosecutors documented violations carefully. Patience thinned as patterns solidified. Despite exposing significant corruption and violent crimes, Casso's inability to adapt sabotaged outcomes. The government terminated his cooperation agreement in 1994. Benefits evaporated immediately, restoring exposure to maximum sentencing. Information already provided remained usable, though protections disappeared. This outcome reflected behavior rather than content. At sentencing, prosecutors emphasized his continued violent mindset, arguing that cooperation lacked sincerity. Judges agreed, citing breaches and ongoing threats. Casso received multiple life sentences without parole eligibility. The deal intended to preserve his life collapsed under his own actions. Excess proved fatal strategically. Ironically, his cooperation still reshaped cases long after sentencing. Eppolito and Caracappa were convicted in 2009, partially based on his disclosures. His testimony contributed to historical clarity regarding mafia infiltration of law enforcement. Institutional accountability followed years later. Yet none of that altered his confinement. Casso spent the remaining years in solitary confinement, isolated within federal supermax facilities. Appeals failed consistently, since cooperation violations remained documented. He continued asserting control rhetorically, though influence vanished. The world moved on while he remained confined. Authority dissolved completely. The flip that failed illustrated the limits of intimidation as a universal strategy. Cooperation demanded behavioral transformation, not just information. Casso provided facts while refusing adaptation. That contradiction doomed negotiations inevitably. Self-sabotage emerged through refusal to yield. His case became cautionary among prosecutors handling organized crime cooperators. Information alone did not guarantee leniency. Compliance mattered as much as content. Casso misunderstood that balance profoundly. Excess defined his downfall. By the end, cooperation exposed corruption effectively, but saved nobody involved, least of all him. Systems absorbed revelations while discarding the source. Control vanished permanently. The strategy that sustained him for decades collapsed under its own weight. After sentencing, locked the door permanently, Anthony Casso entered a stretch of time defined by restriction rather than command, where movement narrowed daily. He spent years inside high-security federal facilities, frequently isolated, monitored, and separated from any remaining influence. Communication shrank to filtered mail and limited legal visits, stripping away tools he once relied upon. The routines felt rigid, predictable, and indifferent to reputation. Power existed only as memory, replayed internally, without effect. During those years, appeals moved slowly through courts, carrying arguments already rejected repeatedly. Judges cited documented cooperation violations, threats, and continued aggression as reasons to deny relief. Each denial reinforced permanence, closing avenues quietly. Casso responded with persistence rather than reflection, maintaining a posture shaped by control instincts. Isolation hardened rather than softened his stance. Health declined gradually, though confinement masked urgency until late. He suffered a heart attack in 2009, surviving but weakened. Transfers between facilities followed, each offering less contact and fewer privileges. The system treated him as a risk rather than a personality. Familiar names disappeared from correspondence lists steadily. Outside prison walls, his name circulated sporadically through trials, documentaries, and court records tied to others. The mafia cop's convictions revived attention briefly, reconnecting past actions to institutional reckoning. That exposure reinforced notoriety without restoring relevance. History absorbed details selectively, leaving fragments rather than a comprehensive legacy. Dominance faded into case files. Former associates referenced him cautiously, often framing memories through survival rather than loyalty. Many avoided discussion entirely, preferring distance from anything associated with exposure. Silence replaced mythology across neighborhoods once familiar. Younger generations recognized the name vaguely, detached from context. Fear did not translate across time. Casso died on December 15, 2020, at the age of 78, inside a federal medical facility. Death arrived quietly, without ceremony or audience. No gatherings followed, no territory shifted, and no structures changed. The system processed his passing administratively. Life moved forward without interruption. What remained of his name existed in disconnected pieces, scattered across transcripts, testimonies, and cautionary recollections. Some remembered efficiency, others brutality, though few recalled warmth or loyalty. His approach left no successors shaped directly in his image. Methods survived selectively, though reputation dissolved. Continuity replaced closure. Violence defined his trajectory, though it never secured permanence. Betrayal followed pressure predictably, fracturing structures he enforced. Isolation arrived gradually, built through choices reinforcing separation. These outcomes mirrored patterns seen repeatedly across similar figures. Individual differences faded beneath structural repetition. His story aligned with a broader cycle familiar within organized crime history. Men ruled through fear until fear removed trust entirely. Control produced compliance briefly, then accelerated collapse quietly. Institutions absorbed damage while individuals vanished. The pattern continued beyond him. Casso's life did not conclude with redemption or dramatic reckoning. It ended through attrition, isolation, and institutional routine. The absence of spectacle underscored impermanence. What mattered shifted toward systems rather than personalities. Names faded while structures endured. In that sense, his legacy blended into a long lineage of enforcers mistaken for architects. Each believed dominance could outpace consequence indefinitely. Each discovered limits through isolation rather than confrontation. History recorded fragments, not triumphs. The cycle continued forward, unchanged by individual endings.